Welcome to the By Way of Commandment podcast, a podcast dedicated to the study of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the finer points of his doctrine. Join us as we study the gospel through the scriptures and standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This might be a somewhat tangential question, but related. Do you see a similar trend in the general lay membership of various Christian denominations and Latter-day Saint religion as well in how we emphasize or have maybe de-emphasized a rigorous study of theology?
It's a general there is a general withdrawal from Christianity and scholarship, which is a part of the general withdrawal from Christianity by Generation Z, if you will. Okay. The number of people who self-identify as Christian has reduced dramatically in the past decade. The number of people who are involved, therefore, in doing serious philosophical work has also dropped dramatically. And I'm just going to make an observation. If I said that, and I think that we have just gone through a period in the world's history where we have seen the greatest wealth known to humankind. And if I said what follows a period of great wealth, anybody who's read the Book of Mormon, I think, would immediately respond, we know this cycle. We've seen this before. Okay. And that's where I think we are. I think we're in the cycle where people are just losing interest in religion because they don't need it. And with respect, I work with people who are going through faith crises quite often. And it's interesting to me the kind of misinformation that people harbor. I don't think people leave solely for scholarly reasons. Very often there are familial or other reasons that are involved as well. Okay. Because persons aren't just alive from the neck up. We're not just talking heads. We have real lives, and we're not just dead from the neck down either. I mean, we actually have a mind. But we're both of those. We have a heart that beats and gives life to our brains, right? And our brains can't really explain the consciousness that we experience, in my view. And so there's a lot more to us than just a talking head, which is all you ever see on a podcast. But I think that we have a generation that has access to a lot of information. My experience is that it all comes like a fire hose. You know, it's like trying to drink from a fire hose. They become aware of anti-Mormon issues and they find so many so fast that they can't deal with them. They can't really address them because there's just too much and they just give up. That doesn't mean that they don't spend time looking at it. I had a guy tell me, look, I spent 6 months looking at this stuff. And I'm like, you spent 6 months and you think that's sufficient to arrive at a conclusion on the 40 issues that you brought to me to talk about? Really? You know, I spent 5 years working with just one of these issues and looking at it very carefully. The kinds of issues that I find the most information about are like Joseph Smith's polygamy and marriage and quote unquote marriages to younger girls. I always point out, look, what you're doing is taking something sacred and holy and turning it into something dirty, because that's how it would look if somebody else were doing it. What really happened is Joseph Smith had such a love, for instance, for the Kimballs. I mean, we can take this one in particular. Heber and Velate Kimball had a 14-year-old daughter, and Joseph Smith went and told them that he wanted to be sealed to Heber and his family. And the way to do that was through a sealing ceremony with his daughter. And so what happened is they did this sealing ceremony, they worked it through, and immediately after the ceremony, she got in a buggy and went home with her parents. She never had interaction with Joseph again. And they didn't call it a marriage, they called it a sealing, because sealings were done differently. This is the way that families were sealed to each other. And I see this as an act of love by Joseph Smith. It doesn't involve pedophilia. And now this is contrary to a few years ago. A few years ago, virtually every single scholar argued that Joseph Smith was engaging in some form of pedophilia, that he was engaged in sexual relations. But now, I don't know of any competent scholars that hold that view for these kinds of marriages. And so,
Well, and there's a very
you know,
different understanding of what sealing meant at the time as well. It wasn't sealing husbands and wives and their children together the way that we view them today. There was also another aspect of sealing families and individuals to the prophet.
exactly.
The head of the head priesthood holder of the dispensation was kind of a necessary link in this chain.
Yeah, and that's exactly how they saw it. And so Joseph Smith was linking together the families through these sealings. They didn't call it a marriage, by the way. They call it a sealing. And there's a distinction now. And then people will argue, but he didn't tell Emma about the sealing. And my response was, well, why should he have had to tell Emma about a sealing? I mean, what he's doing is connecting people through these sealing procedures. And whether she knew or not, the record isn't clear. But why would she did have to know? And I point out that DNC 132, for instance, is what I would call a case kind of a text. So in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, you get these kinds of cases, and what they are is, if these are the facts, if this is the situation, if you have an ox and it's in the mire and it's Sunday, here's what you can do. Okay. DNC 132 is the same kind of thing. If this is the situation, if you have a woman and she's been faithful, but her husband hasn't been faithful, then, and if she consents, then you can take her and give her to another faithful man. Okay. We call that polyandry, but it really wasn't polyandry in the sense that in modern use we talk about it. Okay, that's not what was happening. This was more of a form of levirate marriage, if you will, where to make sure that the woman was taken care of. The only situation in which there could be sexual relations for polygamy was if a man desired to take a virgin and his wife consented. Okay. And that's why after Joseph Smith was sealed to several of these girls as a means of sealing families together, when he was moving to a different kind of a relationship, he then went to Emma, received permission from Emma, and not only received the ceremony that was conducted require the presence of the first wife, because she had to give this girl to her husband. And this happened probably 4, possibly 5 times with Joseph Smith. Okay. Um, and we know it's with the Partridge sisters and the Lawrence sisters in particular. And so Emma gives consent. She's there. They go to Joseph Smith's mansion and they only make it a few hours. Emma changes her mind and goes, throws him out. So if anyone's wondering why Joseph Smith doesn't have any offspring from polygamous wives, as we would say today, they're not really polygamous wives, most of them. Most of them are not wives in the proper sense of having sexual relations at all. And those that were, it's a real possibility Joseph Smith never got to be able to consummate any kind of a relationship because Emma changed her mind too darn fast. Okay. Which is perfectly understandable. I understand where Emma's coming from. I'm not in any way judging her, but the bottom line is that if we understand historically how these kind of things are working, the argument that Joseph Smith is just lying to Emma, I think, evaporates. And there's a lot more in DNC 132 that we could go through. But so when I'm working with people to work through these kind of faith crises, I have people come to me and say, well, what about the Book of Mormon? And I'll hand them a copy of my expansion theory article or something like that and say, look, you've got to understand the nature of the translation process. But before you make a final decision, understand there's a good deal of evidence of antiquity in the Book of Mormon. Understand that there are things there that Joseph Smith provided that nobody in his day knew anything about. They were only discovered beginning in the 50s and 60s, and only then by scholars who had access to Near Eastern Treaty Covenant documents. Okay, so they could recognize what they were looking at. And there's not, I've been looking now for over 40 years. I can't find another 19th century work that comes close to replicating these kinds of what we would call a Formschrift in German. What do we call that in English? We call it a literary form, I guess, a legal form. It's really a legal form. As an attorney, I know that if you don't use the proper legal form to do your documents, like a complaint, it gets thrown out of court. It has to be done in a very particular way in order to be legitimate. Well, Joseph Smith replicated those kinds of legal forms in the Book of Mormon repeatedly with respect to a formal prophetic calling, a prophetic lawsuit, the renewal of the covenant, which were very formal kinds of things in very formal settings. They had a particular setting in which they had to be as well. How he would know those kind of things is what has to be explained. And I have one explanation, and a secular scholar is going to have a completely different explanation, but I've never seen an adequate explanation that just didn't go like this and say, well, he had a Bible, that kind of a thing. Okay. So, anyway, I can see why people have questions. I think that there has to be a transition from the faith of a child. This is what I received from my parents and what I heard in Sunday school, to now I'm ready to be an adult and I'm ready to study more seriously and understand and see the issues. I hear people getting upset when they didn't hear all of this in Sunday school. Okay. And to a certain extent, I can understand that. But, we call Sunday school teachers who have been in the church for a year or struggling to do their best just to get a lesson off. We call single mothers who have 5 kids and, have 30 seconds to spend on getting their lesson together. A mother's going to spend a lot more time than a priesthood leader who might just think about it 5 seconds before he walks in the door that day. So, Sunday school lessons are what I would call the devotional language game. They're not aimed at the language game of scholarship. There are two different things going on. And so, convincing people that they haven't been hoodwinked by people who are trying to hoodwink them, that is simply a matter that they didn't. I don't want to say they didn't pay attention, but I do want to say I knew all about it. And if you had paid attention the way I did, you would also know all about it.
Yeah,
Okay.
and it assumes ill intent on the part of the Sunday school teachers and
Right.
the church at large for having called Sunday school teachers who are not scholars in these areas to teach them this um, the more rigorous scholarly view
Yeah.
of things.
Well, and it's the same thing with seminary and high school, and that's really the devotional language game is what they're playing. But I will say this: I do fault the church a bit. When people are taking a religion course at BYU, they should be taught a college level sophistication and complexity of issues. They should be introduced to, for instance, the documentary hypothesis. They should know about the issues with the synoptic gospels and authorship of various New Testament writings. Those kinds of things should be discussed in the classes. The issues that confront the Book of Mormon ought to be discussed in a Book of Mormon class. At a college level, people should be apprised of these kinds of issues. And I don't think that's been happening. It has been happening more recently, I would add. But I don't think it happened much before that. And it may be because the people who were there didn't know much about it. People forget, and I can tell you because I grew up during the time of the revolution in Mormon history. People forget that there are literally hundreds of thousands of documents, and there was a large period of exploration just trying to figure out what those documents said and meant. And it was happening in the 60s and 70s largely, began probably in the late 50s. And the people who are involved in the church are learning themselves about these issues for the first time. They don't know because this is true historical research. And so, uh, you know, I want to cut a ton of slack and charity to those who have a faith crisis. I think for a lot of them, it's a very difficult thing to go through, but it ought to be something that people actually go through. We need to change the way we think as children to the way we think as adults and become more critical and really much more involved in our assessment than we were when we were growing up. Everybody but me, because growing up somehow I went through a bit.
Do you see that this motivation come across in the books you've written? I think you're probably most well known for the Exploring Mormon Thought book series. Is the kind of the underlying motivation for writing that, or were there other motivations involved in?
Oh, I wrote Exploring Mormon Thoughts. It began mostly as notes to myself that I would put together. And here's the reality of it. When I wrote the first 3 volumes of Mormon Thought, I would study an issue intensely. and just eat, breathe, and drink an issue. And then I would wake up one day and I would have a full chapter organized in my mind, complete with footnotes. I would just get up and type it up. And I realized that what I had was a college level textbook for an upper division philosophy course that I had essentially put together. And I told David Polson about it. And so I put it together and used it and taught 3 upper division courses in philosophy of religion because there were no Mormon texts to be used in philosophy of religion. And so I put this together that would come from a Mormon perspective that would critique historical Christianity from a Mormon perspective and look at philosophical issues very critically from that perspective. And then Greg Colford got wind that I was using this text in the philosophy course and wanted to publish it. It was the very first thing he published through Colford Books. And so that's really how that came about. I didn't do it really to start to answer questions for people, or I didn't even begin initially to do it because I was writing a text. I did it initially because I was basically studying something intensely, and my mind works in such a way that it organizes things
Yeah,
for me. So
I have a I don't know if this is similar to how you think of things or whatever, but I'll be working, I'll be doing something during the day, and I'll have an entire list of things kind of flood my mind of problems to solve, questions to ask, things that are related to the gospel, and I have to write them down in the moment, and I have this with me almost always during the day, and so I can do text to speech or
right.
vice versa, speech to text in my notes. And so I'll just have at the end of the day 3, 4, 5 pages of just ramblings throughout the day that I can look at the end of the day and kind of try and make sense of my thoughts earlier in the day. But it's been incredibly helpful in just putting out there my ideas and my questions and anything that pops in my head. It's on my notes. I have it to refer back to, and I can organize them. Whereas if I wait till the end of the day when I get home and I'm able to write things down, I don't remember anything. So it's been incredibly helpful to have that tool. But I found that I study best when I can do this, when I have that available to me.
I think that's smart. I have suggestions for people actually. When you have these kinds of insights or you have a breakthrough and you see something that's like, oh, wow, that's interesting. I now see that where I didn't see it before. Write it down immediately. Don't wait because you're going to forget it or you're going to put it off to a point where you're going to go back 2 months later and go, gee, what was it I was thinking? And the other thing is, and Truman Madsen taught me this, there's something magic that happens when your understanding and thought goes from your brain to paper. Okay. You're using neural pathways in writing something down that tend to consolidate memory and consolidate understanding. And like when I taught philosophy, I required every single reading to be outlined by the students. And the outline wasn't just an outline. I would ask them to argue with what they're reading. Or if it creates an insight or a flash, write down your flash of, oh, wow, this is cool. Look at this. And that's when real learning starts to take place. If you're reading a book, write in the margins, argue with it, say, oh, well, what about this? Or wow, this is cool. Look at what this means. In doing so, you will consolidate the memory, you'll facilitate learning and critical thinking. And most importantly, you'll have notes to go back to so that you can remember. And so this is a very, very important thing to do. And the outline itself, I think, really helps to organize your thought in such a way that, oh, this is what's being said and why it's being said, and here are the supporting arguments. And then, oh, what about this? Here's how I would argue against this. And so these kinds of outlines, I found that the ability of people to write essays, to think critically, just multiplied exponentially when they undertook that kind of an effort. The challenge with people who are only on computers, they can't interact with it. Things don't stick in the memory in the same way just looking at a computer screen as when you're writing in a book or interacting with it physically. So, for instance, I have eidetic memory. I can tell you if I read a book, it's strange because I can read a book backwards in my mind. I can tell you where it is on the page and which page it's on. If I find the page spatially, I can go and I can read it. A book I've read a decade ago, I can pull it up.
Yeah, you can't do that
And
on a
so
screen.
you can't. But I mean, I'm talking about just pulling it up in my mind. I don't have to have the physical book in front of
Sure.
me because I have this spatial orientation. I know where it is on the page, where it is in the book, and where how far it is from the back. And once I can locate it in that way. Now, not everybody's memory works that way. Some people are what I call oral learners. They once they hear something, they retain it. Once they I don't know how they do that. I'm not an oral learner. I'm a visual interactive learner. But my experience is that this interaction is really, really critical to learning, retention, and understanding. So that's my recommendation for people who are in school, especially for people if you're studying philosophy or law. People who study law, every single law student does outlines of the areas of law they're working with. Okay, the whole area of law gets outlined, and they work from those outlines. It's a matter of course in law school because there's so much information to assess and understand and be able to argue. And so law students are required to do this by their professors. And if you talk to a law student who doesn't have any outlines, you talk to a law student who didn't make it through law school. So that's, this is a kind of very essential practice. And that's what I'd recommend for people who are in school and want to learn something. The same thing with language. I would just write it down and then interact with it. But there's another way. I mean, this is also essential not only to learning language, but maintaining it. You've got to be willing to be like a little kid. You've got to be willing to make mistakes. Okay. I take every opportunity I can to speak Spanish or Italian or French, and at times German with people, because if I don't, I lose it. But more importantly, that's the only way to learn it in a way that it's useful and interactive. And so, if I make a mistake and somebody corrects me, it's like, well, okay, I'm a 3-year old compared to you, and 3-year olds make mistakes when they speak, and I'm happy to be corrected because I've got a child mind. It means there's a lot I don't get about your language. Now, in some languages, I feel very proficient. There's a few languages I think I could teach and actually have taught philosophy level, college level classes in those languages. But um, others, I'm at a 3-year-old level, and I'm presently studying Russian and want to get Russian down. And so, and Russian is some languages are truly foreign and some aren't. Tongan, I suspect, is truly foreign. The languages in Asia are truly foreign. Chinese, Taiwanese, Vietnamese, these are truly foreign languages. In English, just knowing English, I already know 80% of Spanish and French and Italian. Okay. We have cognate words. And I know that if I want to say a word, um, all I've got to do is use the English word and throw a certain kind of ending on it, and I know I've got the word in that language. But languages like Russian are truly foreign. Now there are some loan words in Russian too, but and it's like Greek. You already know a lot of. A lot of English is derived from Greek. Latin, you already know a lot of. So learning these kind of languages, you've already got most of it down. Um, and once you learn how the language works, you can just almost begin to speak it just knowing English. So, um, you know, my view is if you're afraid of making mistakes when you speak a language, you'll never learn the language. It's just
Yeah.
the way that it is.
Yeah, that was a big hurdle for me in my mission when I was first started to study Tongan, is actually having to speak it to somebody who was not just fluent in Tongan but was from the islands, and that was their only language, and
Right.
knowing I was going to mess up and having to overcome that hurdle was scary, but that's probably the best thing I did, was having a mission companion who prodded me and poked me and forced me to come out of that shell and do that.
I wish I'd had native speakers on my mission. I think it would have been so helpful. And I think those native speakers are so valuable for their companions, especially when they speak a foreign language. I remember a particular experience. I was speaking Italian to a 4-year-old kid. And I thought I was really good in Italian. Okay. And all of a sudden, this kid just cracks up laughing at the way I said a few things. And, I realized that I don't even have a 4-year-old proficiency in a language in which I've taught college level classes. So it's just
Yeah, I've had a number of experiences on my mission like that as well. The kids can be particularly cruel,
oh, they're just too honest.
but
I
they're way yeah, that's what it is.
Now, what a lot of people don't know about me, I was in the nursery. I was the nursery leader for a year and in the nursery for 3 years in my ward. And it was a very humbling calling because I was not as good at it as other people in there. And what I what I learned is that kids are just honest to a fault. I had dirt on every single parent of those children because they're so darn honest. And the better thing is, I got to have I got to have snacks on Fast Sunday. And I just, where do you get a better calling than that? I remember one time our state president, who later became a member of the 70, came in with his first counselor. And the first counselor pointed to see, he said, "You see that guy over there on the floor playing with toys with graham cracker all over his suit? He speaks a lot of languages." And then they just walked out. And it was like, I don't know if that was a compliment or a dig. But I love being in the nursery. I love being, my daughter was in there when I first started. And I just love being in there. So, you know, and amazingly, I learned a lot from those kids.
Yeah, I've had a we won't get into this, but I've had a number of experiences with my own kids that I look back and I'm just blown away at some of the things that they've taught me.
How old are your children?
My son will be 7 in a few months. My daughter's 5, and we have a 4-month old
Oh,
baby boy as
wow.
well. So
You're right in the
they're
middle of it.
young. Oh yeah.
It goes so fast. Cherish every moment you have. My oldest is turning 42, and my youngest is 27, and I have 14 grandchildren. And I've learned two things in my experience. The first is the greatest teachers we have in life are our children. I suspect there's a reason God set it up the way he did with families, because children, no learning takes place inside a comfort zone. And children have a way of taking us out of our comfort zones repeatedly, stretching us to a point. I got stretched to a point I didn't want to be stretched. And I learned all kinds of things I was not really willing to learn. Okay. Because I got stretched way beyond my children. And they've been my greatest teachers. My wife has been my second greatest teacher. I suspect there's a reason why the principal idea in the plan is for men and women to be together, and that's because we're so different. We call it opposition in all things, I think, in women. She's very different than I am. She's much kinder and thoughtful, and my wife is really an amazing person, but she sees things very differently than I do. And because she's so different from me, I've learned a great deal. She's been a really great teacher to me. And so I think mortal life is set up in such a way that we're going to get the challenges to learn the kinds of things that we came here to learn. Anybody who's read my book, my fourth volume on theodicy, knows that that's my theodicy is a pedagogical theodicy where we're really here to learn from life's experience. And one thing in particular, and that's to learn to love, and to learn to love in a particular way. And that's the way the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost love each other in their unity. And so I view the purpose of life and all of the commandments and everything the church does is teaching us that kind of love and how to be in that kind of relationship. And that's it's a pretty big challenge, but think of what that really means for us. What it means is the greatest reality I can even, that's way beyond my conception, is what I've been invited into. And so my theology is essentially built around that reality. That's what I see really going on. And at the end of the day, what really matters is kindness and love and properly being able to be with people in a very intimate sense. And people who've read my books know that I adopt Buber's I thou relation as a very important tool, both for hermeneutic and heuristic tool for teaching about what is really happening in interpersonal relationships, how we often objectify each other. Don't treat each other as a thou, but how a thou. And this is the, I think this is a distinction that a lot of people don't get. A mere object is something we can learn all about. We can take it and manipulate it and bend it to our advantage, but it's a mere thing. A thou is a mystery, a sacred mystery that has to disclose itself to us, reveal itself to us, or we don't know. And so what I see God being up to is breaking down the kinds of categories we use. A lot of people do this. If you go into a store, you may become aware after being there for 15 minutes that there's actually music playing that's been playing the whole time. You've just been filtering it out of your experience, right? We use this kind of filter to filter out almost all of the data coming into us. Almost none of it reaches consciousness. With God, we kind of overlay what we're going to be willing to experience of God to what we think God has to be before we meet God. Okay. So God has to be the one who protects us from evil. He has to be the one who can overcome everything. He has to be the one who's absolutely ethical, given our ethical judgments. Okay. And so we take God and put God in a box. And if we do that, and that's what most scholarly study does, by the way. And if we do that, we'll never get to know God. We'll get to know about an image of God. And we call that, in Israel, they used to call that an idol, an image of God, okay, or an image of a God. God has to reveal himself. We have to be open to allow him to surprise us about things that we couldn't fathom or know or would never have suspected. And so my approach to philosophy and theology is one of this kind of I thou encounter. And an encounter is this kind of disclosure where the thou reveals itself. It's not appropriated, it's not manipulated, it's not put upon by our own categories before we get to it. It's something that reveals itself to us, and in so doing reveals ourselves to us, because we become a thou also in this interaction. Anyway, those who have read my books know that that's kind of the perspective that I bring to that. So
I I want to make a an observation from your books. I've read actually I'll tell you the first time I became acquainted with your work at all was not from your Exploring Mormon Thought series. I was actually studying I had started over the Book of Mormon and was reading through First Nephi. Um and I was writing down all of the similarities and differences between Lehi's visions and Nephi's visions. And then I was comparing and contrasting them with the visions in the New Testament that Peter had and Paul and a few others. And I thought, well, let's go to the Old Testament and see what the visions of the prophets in the Old Testament looked like. And I just had a blank piece of paper that I was just writing down all of my thoughts and comparing and contrasting the various uh, spiritual experiences or visions and dreams of these prophets. And at that time, I was wondering if there was anybody who was a Latter-day Saint who would have access to and a knowledge of the Book of Mormon, who could incorporate the Book of Mormon text alongside these other biblical texts in the same manner that I'm doing, looking for the comparisons of these various prophetic um, experiences. And after a 15-minute Google search, I came across this paper about the throne theophany experience of Lehi and First Nephi. And it was a paper that you had produced. And um, I found it incredibly helpful. You provided me with some extra citations to look into. You provided uh, some extra scriptures and extra biblical non-canonical works to look at as well. And I found that incredibly helpful. And that led me to another paper that you wrote, clothed upon a what's called clothed upon a unique aspect of Christian antiquity, which I found, and this is several years ago, at a time when I had decided to take my study of the scriptures and the study of the gospel a little more seriously. I felt complacent at the time. I felt that progression in knowledge and faith and testimony had kind of plateaued. And it was at this time I decided to take things more seriously. And so I was studying these things, and this led me to one of your papers, which led me to the second paper. And I have to tell you, um, I consider that paper, Clothed Upon, to be uh, an inspired work in insofar that I felt the Holy Spirit present things to me in a way that I never would have considered had I not decided to take things more seriously and to eventually come across your paper. That there are certain things in your paper that not just were theologically or intellectually stimulating, but provided an opportunity for the Spirit to kind of teach me a few things that I felt were very important for me at that time. And so I have that paper really to thank for a few questions that went answered at that time in my life. And that's really where I first became acquainted with your work. It's only then that I realized that you had a whole number of books and other things that you had produced, which I've been lucky enough to read and to understand at least somewhat. I'm not a theologian, I'm not a philosopher, but your works, particularly the Exploring Mormon Thought series, has been incredibly helpful in providing me with some intellectual, thought-provoking questions and arguments to consider. But really, it's that paper, Clothed Upon, that I have to thank for introducing myself to you and providing me with an opportunity um, to take my testimony more seriously at that time. And so, and there's something I want to make an observation about your works. Um, for those listening who have not read any of Blake's works, you'll notice that they're very dense with information. They're dense with intellectual, very, very intellectually stimulating arguments for various philosophical and theological topics. But you'll notice, I think, that they are, and I mean this in the most sincere way that I possibly can. They are not merely um, intellectual works. They're not merely intellectual stimulus. They are written in a way that, at least from my perspective, your faith and testimony is embedded in everything you write. And I feel that come across. And I think anybody who reads, especially who reads Fire on the Horizon, will pick up on that right away. This is an intellectual exercise for sure, but it is much, much more than that. And I would suggest to anybody who's new to studying philosophy and theology, who's a Latter-day Saint, I would start with Fire on the Horizon to become more acquainted with your writing, for this purpose, because I think there's so much that it offers, not just in an intellectual manner, but in a spiritually uplifting tone as well.
Well, thank you for that. You got to cut me some slack because the Clothed Upon was written while I was still undergrad at BYU. It was one of those papers you vote had to be published. And I don't know that I would change much, but because I'm dealing with a subject that I can't really just take and grab by the horns and directly talk about it, was meant to be evocative and kind of pointing in directions that people who are familiar with the subject matter would understand. And I appreciate that. No person can escape his or her own skin. What we are will come through in everything we say and do and write. Every word that we speak will reveal about us. And so I appreciate that. And you know, I've had experiences that, are formative, where I'm a knower. I there are a lot of people who won't use the term I know. I use that term. Um, now I'll be, I don't always measure up. I don't know anybody, and I'm certainly one of them, but I don't know anybody who hasn't in many ways violated their own ethical um, knowledge or what they take to be ethical obligations. We've all violated what we take to be our ethical duties, right? Or what we take to be ethically binding on us, if you don't believe in duties. And so every single one of us has still got a lot of work to do. And if, and thank you for what you said, if what I write can be of some assistance on, different levels for folks, because they'll approach it wherever they are. And there are different levels at which to approach a work in a text. And I've written so that those different levels can be approached that way. And, I deeply appreciate that. That warms my heart.
Well, I can't tell you how much I appreciate what you've done, not just with the books and articles you've written, but podcasts you've been on, a number of things that you've contributed to. And there are many others I have to thank as well for helping me in my own development. Um, but you and your work has a place, at least in my heart and in my mind, for helping steer me and direct me to questions, to um, subject matter that I probably would have never come across on my own had I been left to my own devices. Um, and so I appreciate that. And there's something you made mention of a few minutes ago that I wanted to touch on for a second as well. Uh, My mission was an incredibly important experience for me, as I would imagine it should be. Um, I was relatively inactive prior to my decision to serve a mission. I essentially I would attend church meetings out of the wishes of my parents. Um, Although I was probably what you would consider agnostic. Um, and through a number of discussions with family and friends, I had decided to um, actively engage with the Book of Mormon for the first time. And that's really what began my journey into developing a testimony for myself. Now, I served a mission, and during my mission, I had began studying the New Testament for the first time by myself and the Old Testament in that order. And I came across a number of, because going on my mission, I felt like I was behind. I was um, trying to make up for lost time, having not been actively engaged in the church and with the gospel in any real um, sense for many years. I felt that I needed to do my due diligence and study the text, study the Book of Mormon, study the New Testament, and really understand what it is we believe, what the scriptures say, more so than just listening to gospel doctrine discussions on Sunday. And so it's during this time that I had began studying and writing down my notes rigorously and trying to memorize the scriptures is essentially what I was trying to do. And as a missionary, that's pretty common. You want to memorize the scriptures to have them available to you in a moment's notice when you're discussing some topic or another. During this period of time, I had a realization as I was reading the New Testament. This could not be a merely intellectual endeavor. I could not just study about the gospel. I could not study about Jesus Christ and his teachings. Um, I had to actually put forth a different kind of effort to come to know my heavenly Father and my Savior in a way that's more than just knowing about them in an intellectual fashion. There are a number of scriptures that I read during this time that would point to that. You know, we get to the first and great commandment is to love the Lord thy God And depending upon which gospel you're reading, it might say something like with all your heart, might, mind, and strength, or with all of your um, heart, might, and soul, or something of that effect. And I realized that those are different things. Loving somebody or loving God with your heart is not the same as loving him with your strength or loving him with your mind. These are different aspects and components that must come together to form a complete love. And I had this realization on my mission that this was the case, and so this epiphany, I guess, um, is what led me to change how I studied, and from a more intellectual endeavor to trying to apply the teachings the messages of the scriptures, the message that the Savior is trying to teach these people here in the New Testament, and try to apply it in a way that was more directly a part of my service as a missionary. And that's when I started to see some of the greatest blessings occur with those that I taught. And I don't think that was certainly wasn't planned. You never plan on some of these experiences, but the Lord has a way of prodding you along and showing you things along the way that are necessary for our growth. But it was this aspect of there are various ways in which we must come to know God, and doing so in a merely intellectual fashion won't cut it. It doesn't matter how theologically savvy you are. It doesn't matter if you have memorized every word of the Bible from front to back and can recite it at the drop of a dime. If the messages that it contains aren't embedded in your heart and lived in your experience.
Yeah, Really Madison used to call that being dead from the neck down, an only intellectual approach to matters. It doesn't really work that way. It's what I said, if we were just talking heads, but we're not. And I resonate with what you're saying. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine. But this is something that I really appreciated with I read through the Exploring Mormon Thought series, and then I read um, Fire on the Horizon afterwards. And so it was a very different change of pace in the style of book that I really appreciated, and that um, this is kind of the message that was reaffirmed to me as I was reading Fire on the Horizon was a callback to this revelation that I had on my mission, and how we are to engage uh, in loving our Heavenly Father in a multiplicity of ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, either we bring everything we have and are to the table, or we don't really bring anything to the table. Because God's not going to put up with anything less than that for some odd reason. But it's the same with a marriage, right? I mean, you've got to bring everything you are. And the great thing about a marriage is you bring all of your issues and all of the crap, and then you've got to work it through with somebody that you love. And what the irony is that the people we say we love the most are the ones we usually end up hurting the most and being hurt by the most usually. So, life is set up in such a way. We're not just talking heads. We're not just scholars. We're people who live real lives with family members, with others in our lives. And every time we take up to speak about something, we're doing it to persuade. We're doing it because we have some kind of an agenda, right? We're not doing it just because. Though I wrote, I kind of did write Exploring Mormon Thought that way. I was doing it just because. Um, but the bottom line is I was doing it because it's something I love. It's something that speaks to me, that I study intensely. And there's a reason I study it intensely. That's because it matters to me. So when a person is addressing this and they are feigning that they are purely objective and they're only approaching it as a scholar, that's not true. It's incapable. We're capable of doing that. It's impossible for a living human being to have this kind of a life that is dissociated from being a living being. Okay. We're souls, we're body, and we're heart, might, mind, and strength is what we are. We're everything put together. So I appreciate that. And scholarship needs to be done. We need to be as honest as we can. And I really believe that if we're doing the scholarly language game, that we need to do the best we can to control for our biases and to be honest about our biases. These are my biases. I'm not hiding them. I'm letting you know so that you can control for them. And if you find that my biases are disqualifying, a lot of people do. Well, you're a Mormon, so I can't take anything you say seriously. Well, if you're being that dismissive, you'll never learn anything, and that's your choice. Um, and my own commitment is that there's not a single person from whom we don't have a great deal to learn. And often the ones that we have the most to learn from are the ones that are most difficult to learn from. They're the hardest people in our lives. It's because, as I've said before, it's easy to love people who are lovable. It's those who aren't lovable that really teach us about love. So, um, that's how I see life being set up. And you're right. You see the providential work of God in your life, and I see the providential work of God in your life as well. I can tell you that I couldn't possibly make sense of my life and what I've experienced without it. I'll share. We've already spent a lot of time, but I'm going to share one experience that I had on my mission, just kind of put some of this into perspective. I was in Milano on Via Resi, and right across the street from our apartment was a bus stop, and we got up early in the morning, went over to the bus stop. And this woman came. She happened to be black. She came to us and she looked at me and she said, "Are you ministers of God?" And I looked at her and said, "Yes, we are." She said, "Would you teach me? I saw you last night in a dream, and God told me to come to you and find you." And of course, I was gobsmacked. That doesn't happen very often. And we began to teach her. Now, this was in the end of March 1978, just to put this into perspective. And so we began to teach her. She had a little boy, Simone. Now, she was actually from Ethiopia. That we called her Mary. That was not her real name. She had an Ethiopian name. And we taught Mary. She quickly progressed through the discussion. She loved everything we told her. The members loved her. She was wonderful. And we came to a point where she was ready for baptism. But at that time, blacks could not hold the priesthood in the LDS church. Um, And so I had a large argument with my companion. I argued that we ought to tell her everything so she can make a decision based upon full knowledge. He argued we ought to wait, give her the gift of the Holy Ghost so she'll have some divine help and understanding. There are merit to both views, but I was the senior companion, so I won. And of course, I was really worried about it. And I discussed it, what to do with a few other people, and I got a call that morning from an individual who had been in what we call the LTM, the language training missions, now the MTC. He had been in the LTM with me, and he was kind of a common jokester. I mean, if this guy was in your apartment, your bed was going to be short sheeted every other night, just to give you an idea. Okay. And he called and said, "Look, Blake, don't go tell Mary that blacks can't hold the priesthood, because we learned this morning that they can. Blacks can now hold the priesthood in the church." And I was really angry and upset. I said, "Look, this is not funny. You know how much this means to me. And to joke about this is just off the charts bad. You're evil." Okay. He said, "Well, wait just a second." He went and got my mission president, came phone, and then I knew about my mission president. One was that he was never going to tract. And the second was that he was never going to tell a joke. Okay. So he came on the phone and said, "Elder Ostler, this morning we received a wire from Salt Lake telling us that all worthy young men in the LDS church can now hold the priesthood regardless of lineage." And I just fell on my knees. I cried in gratitude and overwhelmed by what was happening. And so, I couldn't have been more stunned if you dropped a ton of bricks on me. We got up and we went over to her house because we had this appointment with her. And I told her what I had prepared to say. I said, "I want you to know that until this morning, people who were of African descent could not hold the priesthood in our church. And I want you to know that I'm sorry about that. What that means is you've seen the kids passing the sacrament. Your son wouldn't have been able to do that. You've seen the people blessing the sacrament. He wouldn't have been able to do that. But as of this morning, they changed all of that. And she looked at me and she said, "Did they change that just for me?" And of course I said, "They did change it just for you because you led the way. You were faithful and God led you here. And it's because of people like you that it got changed. So yes, they changed it just for you." And she said, "Well, that's nice of them." She didn't understand the magnitude of what was going on, I don't think. I did my best to explain it, but I understood the magnitude of what was going on. That kind of an experience taught me to never assume that things can't change, to never assume that God isn't right around the corner, and to be able to see that normal people that you never expect are the ones who are going to work miracles. And so I have a great deal of gratitude for having been able to experience that and what we went through. The timing was so perfect. I don't see anything in it but God's hand. Okay, and that's is because of experiences like that and many others that the issues that we talk about are not scholarly issues. When I talk about blacks in the priesthood and what was entailed in that and why, and the injustices involved and so forth, this is not merely something that is an academic discussion for me. There are real flesh and blood people who were affected, and real flesh and blood people who affected it and changed it. And I'm just grateful for those kinds of experiences. So anyway, I just wanted to share that.
Well, thank you. I don't know that I have any experience that lives up to that from my own mission, but um,
But it's
on it.
okay. I haven't been to the moon, and if I were speaking with Neil Armstrong, God rest his soul, he would have the ultimate one-upsmanship, right? I don't know if you've heard Brian Regan on this. You know, yeah, I won the World Series. Oh well, I was the most valuable player in Super Bowl. Yeah, well, I walked on the moon. Um, I don't think it's a matter of comparing stories because any story you have will be comparable, because they're life transforming, and that's what it's all about.
Um, I, there's something incredibly important to understand when we talk about things. When we try to make our best arguments for or against a particular doctrine or theological argument, um, we can't hide from our biases, but we have to recognize the bedrock, the foundation of everything we come to know in a truly personal way with God has to come through a divine experience, the Spirit being involved in our lives. It has to come through a revelatory experience where we come to know something about God and ourselves.
Yeah,
Um, we can talk all day to where we're blue in the face about um, a particular passage of scripture or any number of theological positions. Um, but at the end of the day, they have to come from and be confirmed by some sort of spiritual experience as that the foundation for why we do what we do and why we think what we think. And I see a danger in trying to completely omit any um, not just our own personal biases about certain intellectual arguments that we might have with various theological positions, but as we try to disseminate information, as we try to share the scriptures and the gospel with others in an intellectually stimulating manner, we cannot help but realize how involved the Spirit must be in that endeavor. Um,
it's just a matter of simple honesty with people, to be open with them about who we are, about where we're really coming from, what really motivates us, and to be vulnerable. I mean, if people feel that they want to reject us because of who we are, that's fine. Um, I learned something long ago. The only person who's truly free is the person who really doesn't care what other people think about them. I'm not tethered to what other people think about me, and I don't need their approval. Okay. There's only one person whose approval I care about, and it's not any of my neighbors or anybody else here on earth. So I'm not worried about that. On the other hand, I do want to be open and honest and about where I'm coming from and about who I am. I give a message in part because of who I am. And that's true of every single person that we're dealing with, even if they pretend to simply be a talking head.
Yeah, as I'm known to do on this channel as well, I try to present certain arguments or give my best foot forward in understanding a certain interpretation of scripture or whatnot that I find most compatible with my reasoning. At the end of the day, uh, I can't deny certain spiritual experiences that have led me to the point that I can make these assertions or that I can um, put forth these opinions on how I view certain gospel subjects or topics.
Yeah, and you care about those topics for a particular reason. I mean, the very fact that you're talking about them reveals that these are issues for you that you care about, that they matter to you. Nobody, even if they pretend to simply be a scholar, um, they're coming from a particular point of view that made that particular subject matter something they care about. And so scholars too are vulnerable people. Scholars too, we can do the best to control for our biases. And I think we owe it to those that we interact with to control our biases in the sense that we do our best to get outside of ourselves to see things from other perspectives. One of the great benefits of speaking another language is that we gain such a different perspective on the world than we could have had if we didn't speak that language. The cultural meaning of words is not something that we can get just speaking one language. We are when we learn another language, we get the perspective of an entirely different culture, entirely different way of looking at the world. And I think it's important that we also recognize that the people we're interacting with have different perspectives. But if there were ever a logical impossibility, the logical impossibility of seeing life through somebody else's eyes is the greatest. We're never going to be able to do it, right? I can never get inside your head. I can never see the world really from your perspective, but I can do the best I can when a person is bringing forward a different way of seeing things, doing things, or objections to the way I see things, to do my best to understand where they're coming from. And that's really the best that we can do. And, because of our cognitive limitations, that we have this particular subjective knowledge of ourselves that no one else shares. And that's true of every single person. So if we are honest with people, we'll be upfront about honestly who we are. If we have an agenda, we ought to be upfront about what our agenda is. And we ought to tell people if we're discussing a subject matter, why we cared to even address the subject matter in the first place. I mean, you'll notice that I'm not talking to you about fashions in the 1700s. My wife could tell you all about that. I don't give a fig for that. I give a fig for her because it's important to her. It's important to me. But I don't care about fashions in the 1700s, and I'm not going to take a class about it. I really can't tell you much about it, although I have to laugh at them because now they look foolish, in my view. But there's a reason that she would talk about that, and she could talk about that with you if she were here. There's a reason I can talk about the kinds of philosophical, theological issues that I do. That's because they're important to me. They touch my life. And anybody who pretends otherwise is being intellectually dishonest with both themselves and with the people they're interacting with. And, maybe we're all dishonest in some sense. I often say this one of the greatest things that happened to us when we became mortals was that we could hide and dissemble. We could lie. Because if we communicate, the one thing that every single near death experience has in common when they get to a certain point is communication is not with words, it's telepathically. People know exactly what you're thinking. And that's disarming if you want to stop and think about it. So, one of the advantages we have of being immortal is we can hide, we can pretend, we can lie, we can dissemble. And this gives us an opportunity to try to fool people into thinking we're something different than we actually are. But there's a downside to doing this. And self deception, the problem with self deception is that it's so deceptive. It's so deceptive that we fool ourselves into believing our own lies. And so when we're interacting with others, being vulnerable and honest and open with them about where we're coming from is something I think we owe the people that we interact with. Um, and maybe they'll reveal something both about themselves and about ourselves to ourselves. Okay, maybe I learned something interacting, and I learned about myself just a little bit more, in addition to learning what is being disclosed by the other person. And most of what's disclosed by the other person isn't disclosed in the verbal words that they used. It's not disclosed in the argument and how sound their argument was that they presented, or how intellectually able they were to use the right vocabulary, which is what most fields of study actually consist in. Okay. What really discloses is the way in which they presented matters, the way that they connected, the kindness with which they understood and interacted. That's what I think comes across most for people. And there are some people who are a lot better at that than I am. Okay. Probably most people are better at that than I am. But I think it is incumbent on us to do our best to be an entire person. As Truman Madsen would say, both alive from the neck up and alive from the neck down.